Well, g'day and welcome to the Lyle Shelton Show. It's great to have your company. This week, I want to explore some controversial legislation that passed in the ACT Legislative Assembly just at the end of August. I've got a special guest to unpack all that. And later on in the program, I'll be talking with Karina Ocatel, a Liberal Party member from Victoria who's been in the news. And I want to drill down to what's fact and what's fake about Karina's story if you've been following her travails through the Australian newspaper. But first, as I said, I have a special guest on the program, a good friend of mine, Mark Spencer, who is the Director of Public Policy for Christian Schools Australia. And there's no one better placed to tell us about a very disturbing piece of legislation that passed in Canberra, in the ACT Legislative Assembly, affecting Canberrans. And this is something which I think reverberates around the country and goes to the heart of parents' rights, goes to the heart of the discussion that we're having in this nation about gender, about what it means to be a boy or a girl for children, or male or female, this whole gender fluid ideology, which has really gathered a head of steam since the passing of same-sex marriage, since marriage was degendered back in 2017. Mark, welcome to the Lyle Shelton Show.
Pleasure, Lyle, and thanks for having me. And I see your wonderful book there behind you, and can I encourage all of your readers to go out and buy 2 copies? I mean, I did. It's a great read. You got to have one for yourself, one for your friend, probably one for the country as well. So get 3.
Mark, what can I say? And just to our viewers and listeners, I didn't set Mark up to that, but it just shows what a great friend he is. But I could not disagree with that, Mark. Thank you for that shameless plug of my book. It's available at lyleshelton.com.au in case anyone was wondering. But Mark, it really is great to have you here. I wish we were talking in more happier circumstances. I think what's happened in the ACT could well be a chapter in my next book, potentially. But this is a piece of legislation designed to stop so-called conversion therapy. And when people think about that, they think of perhaps the Russell Crowe movie with Nicole Kidman, A Boy Erased, this whole thing of terrible practices that maybe some religious communities in the United States and the Deep South did years ago to try and turn kids from being gay into heterosexual and the like. That's the sort of thing that I think the ACT was trying to evoke, but that's not really what this was about, is it?
No, it's not what this has ever been about. And those practices were really part of mainstream psychiatry more than religious practices, middle of last century.
So why are religious people pinned with this?
Yeah, we've been tarred with this, and certainly there were some groups particularly in the US, and a small number of groups who would have encouraged people to go down that path and seek that sort of therapy. But that sort of practice, that sort of abhorrent practices that no one's supporting.
And
there is no one in Australia who would be supporting that now.
And that's right. And there was no evidence that these sort of things were happening anywhere in Australia, despite the urgency with which this was pushed by Andrew Barr, the Chief Minister. Yeah,
I mean, this bill was introduced 3 sitting days before the end of the parliamentary term. Their aim was to actually introduce the third last sitting day and pass it the second last. It was only when thousands of Canberrans wrote to their MLAs, contacted the MLA's offices, started to raise concerns about this, that they actually paused and introduced safeguard amendments, which really did nothing, but that at least gave the appearance of listening.
So Mark, let's just go to that consultation process. This very controversial piece of legislation, which really is a nothing burger. It's no one's doing this sort of thing. No one's trying to oppress young same-sex attracted people in this way. Now, it was sort of smuggled in under the cover of COVID, wasn't it, during the lockdown? And that was sort of, what happened to the consultation process as part of that?
Yes, well, because of COVID, they claimed that they couldn't undertake the normal consultation process. They had selected stakeholders being invited to make responses. Mind you, they can do public consultations on planning and a range of other matters as well. But on this one, they couldn't do a full public consultation. Now, we found out about that, raised the alarm with a number of other groups, and there was a fairly strong number of people who made feedback to those consultations. and really challenge the basic assumptions that were being put out by the government in this proposal. But of course, the problem here is that they use that broad language of conversion therapy, which the devil is in the detail. They talk that talk, but when you actually read what's in the Act, when it finally comes to a bill, what you've got is a definition that's so broad and so vague. We had legal advice on it that really was very alarming about the scope of what they were going to cover and criminalise by the bill.
Well, let's just talk about that scope, Mark, because when people think about conversion therapy and what we just described, if people think about the Russell Crowe, Nicole Kidman movie that came out last year and the whole idea of religious people oppressing young same-sex attracted people, it went far beyond that, didn't it? It had some implications for the idea of gender. That was, tell us about that aspect and what was also captured under so-called conversion therapy.
Yeah, so we're not just talking about gay conversion as that movie might have portrayed. We're talking about sexuality and gender identity conversion. Broadly, from the advice that we've got, when we got the bill, we got legal advice on its possible implications. That would stop, for example, or potentially criminalise parents who might have a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old child who says they want to be the opposite sex. If you're not affirming that child in their decisions, if they're not using the proper pronouns, assisting them to go down and reinforce that gender identity, that's potentially criminalised under this bill. If you've got teachers who might want to teach a biblical view of marriage and sexuality, that's potentially criminalised. When you look at, for example, the Healthcare Complaints Commissioner down in Victoria, when they were looking at similar legislation down there, they described promotion of abstinence or celibacy for same-sex attracted people, which is a fairly common response by same-sex attracted Christians who want to live a biblically authentic life. They described that as conversion therapy. So these aren't alarmist claims. They're backed up by our legal advice, and one of our schools got independent legal advice as well and shared the same conclusions. We're talking about a definition there that the Law Society in the ACT came out and said was too broad and too encompassing and too vague.
Well, Mark, there's a whole lot in what you've just said there, which should raise big alarm bells for anyone who believes in freedom of speech and freedom of religion and the freedom to choose. But I just want to go back to what you said right at the start of that explanation you gave us. So you're saying that if 5-year-old Harry comes along to mum and dad and says, I want to be Sally, and mum and dad say, well, look, let's just wait a bit, Harry, and, you might want to make a decision like that when you're a bit older, rather than, go on puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, or even have surgery, as some adolescents have done. That would be potentially criminal under the bill that Andrew Barr, the Chief Minister, has ushered through the ACT Legislative Assembly. Am I right?
Yeah, it really was an unbelievable time down here. In that same period, we had the government passing legislation that would allow 12-year-olds to, without parental permission, go to ACAT and they could be approved and authorised to change their sex on their birth certificates.
What's ACAT? What's ACAT?
ACAT's the ACT Administrative and Civil Decisions Tribunal.
Right.
You could go to
a 12-year-old can go and change their gender on the birth certificate without their parents' permission.
Yep. They can do it with one parent's permission, or if they can't get either parent to consent, they can go along to ACAT. And they can go along to ACAT and then get an authorisation for that to happen without either of their parents being informed of that either.
What did parents at the ACT say when they heard about this, or don't they still know?
Most of them didn't know about it. There was a survey done by a group out of Melbourne called Binary, discredited or attempted to be discredited as push polling by the ACT government and the Greens because they didn't like the results. That just made it very clear that the parents weren't aware of this. It got rammed through the Assembly. You've got at the same stage as they're allowing 12-year-olds to do that, they're also arguing and considering legislation that would increase the age of criminal responsibility to 14 because younger people, can't be responsible. Then you've got this decision-making around changing of gender. And while it's not talk. Now, this legislation isn't directly allowing young people to have medical intervention at those early ages. Once you're on that pathway of social transitioning, puberty blockers, it's almost invariable that's the end result.
Well, that's right. And puberty blockers have side effects, don't they? And certainly cross-sex hormones can cause infertility.
Yeah. They have serious side effects. They're talked about being reversible procedures, but really haven't been trialled in any extended period of time. So we're talking about the watchful waiting process is a very careful, considered response to these issues. And those sort of things are potentially criminalised under this ACT law.
That's outrageous. I mean, that has been the medical consensus for children who are experiencing gender dysphoria, confusion about their biological gender. It has been this watch and wait protocol, but now even that could be criminalised or is criminalised under this legislation.
Yeah.
It's
very, very serious legislation, and you've just got to look at the objects of the Act to know that this, as you know from your experience, Lyle, this isn't about facts and evidence. This is about ideology and an agenda being pushed by activists that really has no semblance of reality about it.
Well, Mark, you're a lobbyist and a very good public policy practitioner. You know parliamentarians both at state and territory and federal level. What did the politicians say to you when you presented the facts of this? A, that conversion therapy doesn't happen, and B, that capturing gender identity in this and criminalising parents and teachers and health professionals is not a good idea. What did they say to that? I mean, I just can't imagine the average person in the street thinking that any of this is a good idea.
No, I mean, the average person didn't think it was a good idea, but that didn't make any difference to the Legislative Assembly. Let me just talk about, there was a couple of some of the quotes from the debate in the Assembly about it. They talk about, we also know that thousands of people have been harmed by this practice for decades. No evidence to support that, but that was one of the claims made. We have the opportunity to pass legislation that will protect and save the lives of thousands of Canberrans. Now, there's no evidence this is actually going on. The total number of suicides in the last decade in Canberra was only 456 people. Now, each of those is obviously a tragedy. I'm not making light of that. But to say and to claim that this is going to save thousands of lives, there's just simply no basis for that. There's no evidence for that. It's simply an ideological statement. And that's the sort of thing that gets put out there and it's put on the public record.
Well, these lies have now created a situation where good people, good parents, good doctors, good counsellors, good teachers could be criminalised for, in good faith, trying to counsel a child in a very reasonable and logical direction. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion has been trashed.
Don't think about taking your child interstate to do it, because you'll get caught for doing that too. That's a criminal offence.
Wow. So if someone from the ACT went and saw a psychologist in Queensland, that's unbelievable. This is really pernicious stuff, and people really need to wake up to what's going on. Mark, you and I have known each other. We fought in the trenches during the same-sex marriage debate as well. But as you know, we said this would happen, that this would be the next thing coming down the road after marriage was degendered. And it was denied at the time, but here it is. It's happening. Lies are being used to usher through this sort of public policy, which really does take away the freedoms of parents and people who have a dissenting view to rainbow political activism. It's really quite serious stuff, isn't it?
It is. You've got genuine people, ordinary mums and dads across Canberra who just care about their young people. And there are issues. I mean, it's a very complicated world now, and young people are exposed to a range of pressures and social media and influencers who push an agenda that we never had in our day. And it is really tough to grow up as a young person in this very sexually confused world. But just allowing people to waiting for people to become adults, to get the maturity to make informed, sensible decisions about these issues. That's the sort of a loving, caring, sensible approach that I think most mums and dads across Australia, most people would actually think was just common sense, just plain sense. It's not a religious bigotry. It's not a particularly religious viewpoint. It's just common sense, and that's the sort of thing that's been challenged.
You're absolutely right there. We've taken leave of common sense. Mark, as you and I both know, a couple of weeks before this terrible ACT law was rammed through, similar legislation passed the Queensland Parliament, though not as bad as that legislation. Parents aren't criminalised under the Queensland legislation yet. But as we've seen so many times, the ACT has been a laboratory for extremist social policy. And we know that the Victorian government under Daniel Andrews, and if it probably wasn't for COVID, they'd be next cab off the rank with so-called gay conversion therapy laws and gender laws, as we've discussed. And certainly the other Labor states will follow suit. So this is really something that parents have got to wake up to, good people have got to wake up to all around the nation before this completely overruns our country.
Yeah, and people need to ask questions of their MPs. Now, what do they mean when they say conversion therapy? All these terms are just being redefined behind the scenes. And I'm sure if you went round to any shopping centre, would anyone put up their hand and say they want to support conversion therapy? No. Would anyone say they want to care for their young people and support them as they're going through difficult times? Yes, everyone does.
Of course. Yeah.
But it's this misuse of language. It's this Orwellian doublespeak that's come into the political narrative that really is calling black white, calling night day. And it's very hard to actually get to the truth in all of this.
Well, Mark, where does this leave the Christian school movement? It's a wonderful movement. I was educated in a Christian school similar to the ones that are part of your organisation. My children went to Christian schools. I'm so grateful as a parent, and I know my wife is as well, that our kids could be educated in an environment that believes what we believe in the home. Now what we believe in the home seems to be criminal. Where does this leave parents and grandparents who want to see their kids educated in these wonderful Christian schools now?
Yeah. I mean, the only saving grace out of this ACT legislation, I mean, despite all the rush to ram it through in the final days of the Assembly, it doesn't actually take effect till March next year. And we've got a territory election in that time. So we'll certainly be calling upon all Canberrans to think about this legislation and this government's agendas in some of these areas. We talk about being the most human rights compliant jurisdiction in Australia, yet we just don't follow basic international law when it comes to religious freedoms and freedoms generally. So, we can do better in the ACT. We can actually have a proper debate around human rights and what it means to be free, to have freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of religion. Sort of freedoms that people have fought and died in 2 world wars to protect. Those sort of freedoms that are fundamental to our democracy, just a basic fair go in Australia. So we've got the chance with the election here, and in Queensland you've got the chance with the election up there to see if you can change the government and change this law.
You're absolutely right. My concern is that people are not awake enough to these issues. It hasn't the rubber hasn't hit the road as yet. A lot of people would see these as theoretical issues. It's a real problem. What you've described is very, very frightening, because we're seeing the left of politics, the rainbow left of politics, wield power in a very brutal way that discards facts, that discards due process, that redefines human rights, that is selective about human rights. Very happy to trash parents' human rights, which are enshrined in international law, as you said, through the ICCPR, and then just pick and choose the rights that suit their political agenda. This is a very frightening use of raw power here.
Yeah, I think the days, unfortunately, of having sensible public policy debate seem to be long gone, and that's a tragedy for all. I think for our society generally. Whether we come up with laws that we'd all agree on or not, I'm not quite that naive or idealistic, but at least having some commitment to the truth and finding out the truth. I mean, a lot of this push has been based on a so-called research report from 2018, which is, when you look at the detail of it, it's counterfactual in a lot of what it said, making outlandish claims that just aren't supported by the evidence. But
let me guess, Mark, that came out of Melbourne University. Am I right?
Yeah, La Trobe University and the Human Rights Law Centre. It's a joint production by an activist group and a very, shall we say, tainted or questionable research centre in the university. the one that produced the Safe Schools program that everyone loves so much.
I was just going to say, unbelievable. Well, Mark, you've been very generous with your time this afternoon. It would be great if we were discussing things that were more joyous, but they're not. The news is bad, and I make no apology for bringing that to my audience. I do believe we can turn the tide in Australia, but it's going to take a big awakening, and I think conversations like today should sober us all, should send a chill down our spine as to what our politicians are doing. Mark, thanks for what you've done to fight this so well on behalf of such an important sector of our community, the Christian school sector, and thanks for being on the Lyle Shelton Show today.
Pleasure, Lyle.
Well, welcome back to the Lyle Shelton Show. Really appreciate your company today. My next guest is Karina Ockertell. She's a former Vice President of the Liberal Party of Australia. She's part of the Victorian division down there. And for those of you who are political junkies or have been following Dave Pello's work on The Good Source, you will have seen Karina as one of the personalities, but also talking about some recent controversies that she's been involved in. She has been featured in the Australian newspaper quite extensively. John Ferguson, a journalist there, has really taken it upon himself to talk about Karina and some controversies with relations to alleged branch stacking, factional power plays, and all this sort of stuff. And I've got Karina on the line because I wanted to talk to her in person rather than just taking the word of the media. And Karina's a long-standing friend. Karina, it's great to have you on the Lyle Shelton Show. Welcome.
Oh, it's wonderful to be on. What a privilege. Thank you, Lyle. And it's good to hear that, like myself, you don't just take the mainstream media and what's out there as the gospel truth. That's the reason why platforms like The Good Source exist.
It's really so important, and we owe our friend Dave Pello a debt of gratitude for creating this. And you know, when I read about you in the newspaper, in the Australian, it might have been front page. It was very prominently featured over the course of about a week or two, to do with a whole lot of things going on in the internals of the Victorian division of the Liberal Party. But you've been singled out, and it's been alleged that you've been stacking branches and involved in power plays. And now, Karina, you know, you're a friend. That's why I went straight to you. Tell us what the reality of this is. Are you some sort of factional warlord, as has been said in the Victorian division of the Liberal Party?
I was very impressed by that title, and I thought, oh, that makes me sound very powerful indeed. I wonder where I have the time in between working full time, having 3 kids, having a 4th one on the way.
Congratulations. That's great news. Well, you heard it here first, folks, on the Lyle Shelton Show. Breaking news. Karina Ockertell to be a mum again. Well done.
Remote learning and all of that going on here in Victoria, contributing to The Good Source. Where there's a time to be a warlord, but, obviously it doesn't take time according to the Australian newspaper. But yes, I, certainly encourage people who share Liberal Party values to get involved. I've, always done that. I think it's so important that we have a strong grassroots base, an army of volunteers to be able to defeat the Labor Party. That is, what I want to see happen, particularly here in Victoria under these current circumstances. I think there's no greater motivation. But, I even met a party member who said that they joined the Liberal Party at a new members function because he heard me speaking on the television saying that we needed more members and encouraging people to get involved. And that was so encouraging to me. So, if spreading the word and encouraging people to get involved is stacking, then, I suppose, that is someone's definition. But the definition of stacking is, where you're paying for party memberships, you're putting people strategically in places that, in order to influence AGM or pre-selection. Well, that's not even possible in Victoria. Our constitution's quite strict, but AGM outcomes. And that's certainly something that I've never been interested in.
Yeah, this is really good, Karina, and thank you for explaining the difference between recruiting and branch stacking. Branch stacking is probably illegal, I think. If it's not, it should be, and that's where someone pays someone's membership so that they can join a branch and then they can sort of control the numbers or manipulate that person's vote. But when But and I've seen this in all political parties over many, many years. Recruiting is something which is done all the time and should be done, because you want people to join political parties and participate in grassroots democracy. And the basis of that in our system is with a political party, or you can be an independent if you like. But it's the two main parties that are the parties of government in the states and territories, and they should be driven by the grassroots, by interested citizens who join up, get involved, vote in pre-selections and volunteer. And that's, of course, what you've been encouraging people to do over many years.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we'll continue to do so regardless, because I do want to see the Labor Party defeated, not for just my generation's sake, but for the sake of my children and generations to come. It's so devastating. And I think it's no more apparent how devastating a Labor government can be in Victoria. And I suppose you're experiencing the same there in Queensland right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, Karina, I want to leave all the intrigue. If people want to look at the machinations that have been going on, they can Google you and look at John Ferguson's articles from the Australian and the like, and they can take them with a grain of salt. But I think the fact that that's many of the accusations that he's made haven't come true against key people in the Liberal Party, like Kevin Andrews is a great elder statesman of the party. And I could go on. And sure, there's probably been some things that have gone on that haven't been good. Factionalism's not a good thing in any party, and I don't encourage that. I think let's have open democracy and have people getting involved and playing by the rules and doing things for the right reason. But the thing that intrigued me in all of the media reporting about you is that every time you were mentioned as someone who had anti-gay views, or was homophobic, or was a Christian soldier. Now, these were pejorative terms, which I think there was something bigger at play here, to try and demean you and to try and make it look odd or silly for people with mainstream views about marriage between a man and a woman being involved in politics. That's how it seemed to me, like a form of soft persecution.
Absolutely. And that's, I suppose, the most saddening thing of all. And I noted the comments under the article that a lot of people were saying whether they were Christian or not, like, is this where our country's at, that you can be labelled a hard right person just because you are a person of faith, which I find, quite incredible. I mean, I've worked for legal aid, I've volunteered overseas. If that's hard right, well, what is, maybe in Victoria, maybe it is in Victoria. But again, my husband was quite impressed actually when, one of the initial comments in an Australian article was that I believed in the Holy Bible and that I followed Jesus. He said, we should get that framed. That's a really good testimony. What better testimony would anyone want? And it's in the newspaper. So it has been interesting, but a lot of the things, and it has been quite shocking, those articles. It's just that one particular journalist that you mentioned that keeps writing about me, no one really else. He was saying that there were secret tapes, but there were no quotes from
That's
tapes.
right.
An apparent, in quotation marks, a quotation that it seemed to appear that it was coming from me, saying that, we only are pre-selecting conservative types, not Christians, but there's no source of that.
It was pretty sloppy journalism. And thanks for, I've been in a bit of a rush today, so I haven't prepared as well as I should have for our interview, but you're quite right. When I saw the first article, it said that there's secret tapes of Karina Okotel. He didn't quote from them. And then the follow-up article came, I think, in the Weekend Australian. Again, there was no smoking gun. It was just all innuendo, smear, trying to make you look like some sort of a weirdo because you believe in the Holy Bible and follow Jesus. And, they said you're homophobic and anti-gay, but hey, maybe that's because you shared a platform with me at the National Press Club where we spoke in favour of marriage between a man and a woman. But heck, 5 million Australians voted with us. This is just really shoddy journalism. It's not even journalism. It's designed to stigmatise people like you and I and millions of others of Australians who have mainstream views and who want to get involved in politics.
Yeah, absolutely. It is really sad, and especially to see that coming from what has been sort of a mainstream paper. The
Australian. It's my favourite paper.
Yeah, me too. It's quite disappointing. means, you know, yeah.
How does reporting like that affect others like you who are wanting to get involved in Liberal Party politics? Is it putting people off getting involved?
Oh, look, I've been contacted by so many party members expressing, you know, their disappointment with that sort of media reporting. People also wondering if it's worthwhile getting involved, if this is, you know, particularly people who are Christians saying, you know, if this is how Christians are treated, which is, you know, really not a good, I suppose, image to be out there. Because the Liberal Party is certainly an inclusive party, welcomes people of all backgrounds, so long as you share our values. Of course, we don't want people who are going to come in and promote Labor Party values or Greens policy in the Liberal Party, but those who share our values, regardless of any other attribute, are absolutely welcome. I mean, you look at our founder of our Liberal Party, Sir Robert Menzies, he was a Christian. So it's, yeah, really disappointing that people who, you know, continue the faith within the party might be painted as someone who's a nutty or nutter or something like that by a newspaper.
Well, that's right. I'm glad you mentioned that because I've read some of Sir Robert Menzies' forgotten speeches published by the Menzies Research Institute, which is the Liberal Party's think tank. And in those speeches, it's very clear that Menzies was a man of faith. He says that a man's most important relationship is with his maker. Forgive the sexist language, but that's the language Menzies used. He opened the Bible Society's office in Canberra, gave a great speech there, and he stood up for the traditional family against Marxism, which tried to bring down bourgeois marriage. And these are the terms that Menzies used in his speech defending marriage. So, you know, for you to be painted as some sort of an oddity by the Australian newspaper, it's just outrageous and disgraceful. And clearly, this is being briefed out against you. You don't have to comment on that, but that's my observation that certain people within the party would be briefing the journalists to this effect. You don't have to answer that question, but I think that's self-evident. Karina, I guess where does this leave you now? Is there some sort of investigation or process going on?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, you know, really, I suppose it has been long overdue. So it's exciting to see, from my perspective, it's exciting to see action being taken in terms of an investigation into branch stacking, because that isn't the right thing to do to, you know, pay for people's memberships, to, you know, try and game vote outcomes in that way. Other issues as well, which I probably can't go into.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
As well, that is something that, you know, I certainly am heartened to see happening within the Liberal Party, that it's not something like in the Labor Party where it's just swept under the rug and people are just going to ignore it. You know, in the Adam Somyurek situation, you know, he resigns from the Labor Party and then they've dealt with that issue. Well, no, Adam Somyurek would be just one person in that whole piece of the puzzle of branch stacking. It's a whole, you know, machine that they would have had operating. But
no, that's right. And to be clear, Adam Somyurek, the Labor Party minister in the Andrews government, who's now resigned in disgrace, he was paying people on an industrial scale to be members. So, and there's certainly been no suggestion that that's been happening in the Victorian Liberal Party or that you've been associated with that. Karina, our time is gone, but I just want to thank you for helping unpack that. I hope it hasn't put any of our audience off politics. You've got to be tough to be involved. You're certainly tough, and to have your name dragged through the national media like that, I think is not an easy thing, and I admire your courage, and thank you for coming and speaking so openly about this on the Lyle Shelton.
Oh, no, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, you know, it is a swamp. There's no doubt about it, but unless good people get involved and stand up, it's going to continue to be that way. So I just keep encouraging people, you know, get involved, please. We need your help.
Well, thanks, Karina. That was brilliantly said, and that's a great note for us to go out on today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in to the Lyle Shelton Show today, whether you're watching on video or podcast. It's been great to have your company. I'd like to thank Dave Pello and his volunteer production team for helping produce this show. and really encourage everyone to get behind the Good Source News. It's creating a platform for people like me and Karina to get alternative commentary out there that is not in the mainstream media. So thanks again for your company. Thanks for being with us. And please tune in again next week for the Lyle Shelton Show on the Good Source News. Goodbye.
The Lyle Shelton Show is a production of The Good Source, hosted by Lyle Shelton. To watch, listen to, or read more content without the SJW PC fact filter, visit goodsource.news. Good, SAUCE.news. Become a Good Source supporter for exclusive access to live and unedited interview recordings, including the conversations before and after the show.